Okay, and we are back. We've had a little bit of a technical issue with Kevin. I'm going to try to get him in here. I have no idea whether he will come in here or not. Kevin, can you hear us? Can we hear you?
I can hear you. Am I
That sounds great. That sounds great.
all
Good
right?
to have you.
Perfect. Just in time then.
Okay, so we're going to kind of continue last week's conversation. I think first we should take a little bit of a chance to introduce ourselves once again, in case people missed last week's live stream. My name is Jeff Johnson. I'm the Chief Design Officer at Nested Knowledge. If you want to introduce yourself, Nicole, go ahead.
Sure. Hi, I'm Nicole Hardy. I'm the Director of Research at Nested Knowledge. And I'll pass it
Ranita?
to Ranita. Oh.
Yeah, I'm Ranita Tarchand. I'm the Director of Client Success and Implementation.
And I'm Kevin, the CEO, founder, and most tech illiterate member of the team.
Yeah, so we are going to talk a little bit about meta-analysis today. So last week we talked about common data elements. If you missed that live stream, it's still available. You can go into wherever you're watching today. Honestly, if you are on LinkedIn, you can just kind of scroll down. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, same thing. The recorded version of last week's live stream is still available, and you can check out that conversation after this one. We were talking about common data elements, though, and specifically what makes our software kind of a little bit different and kind of enables reviews with common data elements. And that, of course, is tagging, specifically the hierarchical nature of tagging in the NK software. And as usual, we have some different perspectives on how helpful that is for maybe some different segments of our audience today. And so hopefully we can answer some of your questions and try to give you some information that's going to help you create better systematic reviews and systematic reviews that can be kind of lend themselves to meta-analysis on top of that. So I want to pose the first question to Nicole. Can you just talk a little bit about, okay, what's the typical review process, right? Like what sets, and of course this is sort of setting us up, what sets NK apart from that typical review process, thinking about like maybe the spreadsheet version of the systematic review, and then maybe the fancy version, the NK version, the version that requires hierarchical tagging in order to really get right. Talk about that process.
Yeah, absolutely. So in a typical review, right, first you have to come up with a research question. That's always like a step 0 is come up with a good research question. And then the step after that is to do a literature search. You need to construct a comprehensive and good literature search so that you can find papers that are relevant to your research question. Once you have constructed a good literature search, or several literature searches across multiple databases, preferably, you then need to screen those results, right? Because when you create these searches, you're doing a query, you get a bunch of studies returned. So you need to sift through them and see, okay, which one of these studies, is relevant to the review, meets my inclusion and exclusion criteria. Speaking of which, I skipped a step. So when you write your research question, you need to write a protocol. So when conducting a review, it's really important that you have your inclusion and exclusion criteria pretty much nailed down once you're starting to do screening. So when you're coming up with your research question, you want to write that good protocol, you want to do a good literature search, and then you do screening. And this is after screening is kind of where, a regular review might diverge a little bit from NK. So a regular review, right? You'll once you finish screening, you'll then extract the data from those papers. And then you put a bow on the Excel spreadsheet and you send it to your statistician, and they pick it apart and find a bunch of errors that they fix, and they do the analysis, and then you write up the manuscript. Right? That's kind of a typical review process in a nutshell. At NK, we kind of have an additional step we throw in that facilitates a different type of review, common data elements type review, which we discussed last time. And that extra data step is tagging. So that data step fits in typically between, the completion of screening and before extraction. So everything up until, really through screening is the same. Inside of nested knowledge, outside of nested knowledge, it's more or less the same. But once you finish screening at NK, what you do is something called tagging. And Jeff, if you want to reference the blog that's coming out, we actually have a blog post coming out.
Great plug. Little self-serving because Nicole, by the way, wrote that. It's great, by the way. You're gonna like it. It's going to be published tomorrow, I believe. So check out our blog and that's a really good article.
Sorry, Jeff, but the point of that blog is to go through on a higher level, like what is tagging. So I'm gonna give like a 10-second elevator pitch on what tagging is, but the way I like to think about it is it's a way to label studies, right? So think of it as, putting a sticky note on a study, and let's say you're researching stroke, and you put a sticky note on it and you say, okay, this is anterior stroke, this is a basilar stroke. You put a sticky note on it, and you've got your pile of papers, and they've got a bunch of sticky notes on them. Each of those sticky notes is a tag, basically. And we just have in my opinion, a much more organized way of doing that. And so you can kind of see the value in, having a sticky note type label to each study, right? Because you can sift through it, right? Let's say all of the yellow sticky notes are anterior and all the purple sticky notes are posterior. You can very easily kind of sift through that big stack of papers and figure out, how many papers do I have on this topic? How many papers do I have on that topic? And really, that's what tagging is. It's a way to be able to sift through the literature in a very organized, systematic way. And we structure our tags hierarchically because I don't know about you guys, but I can only keep so many things in my head at once. More than 10 things, and even that's pushing it, if I'm being honest, then you might run into some troubles remembering all of your tags. So we have to kind of ameliorate that at NK. We have a hierarchical structure to tagging where it's a concept map. That's really all it is. It's a fancy way of saying it's a concept map where, the further down the hierarchy you go, the more specific the concept. So, check out the tagging blog. I go into a little bit more detail, but that's kind of the biggest divergence between a typical review and an NK review is tagging. And then after tagging is extraction, and really everything after that, I would say, is largely the same.
Great answer, Nicole. Largely the same, right? Largely the same. That's what I keep coming back to, and that is on purpose, by the way. There's a lot of people who come in to our software and they're asking like, how much of my work can be just offloaded to like AI, for example, right? How much of this can just not be me? And the answer is oftentimes, well, if you want it to be good, you've got to do it yourself. We really want our software to reflect best practice, and we've worked very hard with experts in the industry to make sure that our software reflects best practice. That's good for auditability, it's good for compliance, and it's ultimately just good for your next research project. Ranita, I want to turn this conversation to you for a second. So Nicole was talking about tagging in her extended metaphor, which I think is a really good one, is sort of like linked sticky notes. It's almost as if you can picture in your college dorm room, you have this patchwork, you would look crazed if you were to put up the NK hierarchy on your wall during your sort of your senior thesis for whatever you're trying to work on at the time. But we believe that process is worth it. We believe it's worth your time to really think about carefully how to set up that hierarchy, how to make sure that hierarchy is really capturing what you wanted to capture from your underlying literature. And obviously you work with some of our kind of our paying clients. Can you talk a little bit about what you tell them when you're trying to teach someone how to set up a great hierarchy, one that lends itself and is amenable to meta-analysis afterwards? How do you do that? Do you want to just talk about that? Maybe show us an example if you have one handy.
Yeah, absolutely. So the sticky note metaphor is fantastic, and as actually a brilliant way to put it out there about why do we do a bit of a qualitative assessment and that sort of thing, right? It really helps when you're trying to go about and trying to write a line and say, okay, how many studies were core lab adjudicated versus, self-adjudicated or that sort of thing. It helps to be able to go and say, okay, these are the amount of studies. These are the actual studies, and you'd be referring to that in the manuscript. But as we're talking about like research design, setting up a hierarchy for like let's say a corporate client that wants to do a meta-analysis, that thinking has to start like right after that screening process. We have to start thinking about how do we want to design this? How do we want to define our independent variables? So, things like our interventions or populations we're comparing, and how do we want to define our dependent variables? So what are we actually trying to collect here? What kind of baseline characteristics are relevant? Because we can't collect everything that's in all these studies, but what is really relevant? What are common things that are being reported across common studies? And particularly this is important for outcomes, right? Because really when we're trying to do a meta-analysis, we're trying to say, what conclusions can we draw from looking at all of these different studies and comparing the results, of course, thinking about things like heterogeneity and evaluating, what types of studies are we actually doing for this sort of meta-analysis, and that's where the risk of bias piece comes in. But really the main thing we're trying to look at here is what can we compare across all these different studies? Hopefully, fingers crossed, they have, similar outcomes or at least one of the same outcomes that we can choose as a primary outcome to compare. I would love to show this, and I'll go ahead and share my screen.
If you're just joining us, by the way, we're talking about meta-analysis today. We're talking about systematic reviews and how you set yourself up for a good meta-analysis on top of that systematic review that you want to do anyway, because you've done half the work. So why not keep going, right? Ranita, you're going to share your screen. I hope we don't have any technical issues. I'm going to see. Hopefully, people can see this. I'm just going to trust our audience to let us know if you can't. But go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So as Nicole was saying, right, we have the protocol function here, which is really going to be our first step in any systematic literature review or any sort of SLR with meta-analysis component, is trying to define what are we actually trying to do, right? Like, can we get a roadmap in place? And you can see for this study that we performed, basilar arteries, we were looking at thrombectomy versus thrombolysis and comparing, our primary outcome here of good functional outcome. So MRS 0 to 3, we want to see, when given one of these therapies, how do people fare? And, we want to compare them across this primary outcome of good functional outcome. We've got our secondary outcomes down here defined. And, maybe these aren't in all the studies. Maybe they don't really have the strength that good functional outcome has as an outcome. And so we make them secondary outcomes. They're good to report. They're definitely something that we want to evaluate. They just might not be in all studies, or, they're strength that they have might not be as good as our primary outcome here, of good functional outcome. And so, you can see that we've really set ourselves up in this protocol to do a meta-analysis, just because we're able to define, what are our independent variables. So we've got our interventions and comparator arms down here. And then what are we actually trying to compare when we're looking at these different interventions and comparators? And so how the NK software is able to take this protocol and make it into a reality is through, as Nicole was saying, the tagging hierarchy. And so, yes, we definitely have the ability, like as we discussed last week, to make this purely qualitative. Maybe we wanted to do something like a true systematic literature review, or even something like a narrative review. We could just look at all of these tags and say, okay, we only want to tag these studies and we want to talk about them, using words. But when we're talking about a meta-analysis, we want to decide what can we actually collect the numbers on and make these comparisons for. And so when we're looking at this hierarchy, we looked at things like study design, patient characteristics, interventions, and outcomes. So our traditional PICO design framework. But as you can see here, we've got our interventions defined using our purple dots here. As our endovascular therapy and our standard medical therapy. And these are going to be what we're comparing across different studies. So when they're given a particular treatment, we can define that as an arm. For our dependent variables, you can see we have a good amount here. Those are going to be our yellow dots, or our data elements. And so when we're looking to configure something, that's a huge portion of this design. We've decided what we want to collect. We've decided the outcomes that are important. Now let's go in and say, how are these reported? How can we actually collect them in a standardized way? And so for our extraction configuration here, you can see we've got our interventions, and those are very easy to configure. So if we want to move this to here, we could, but we'll keep it at interventions because that's the correct placement. And then we've got our data elements here. So we've got things like, age mean. That's a great example of a continuous baseline characteristic that we want to collect. And you can see that we have the option to, let's say, make this continuous. When we make that a continuous variable, we're able to define, a baseline or expected time point, so either baseline or outcome. We're able to say, what direction would be better. Age doesn't really have a direction in terms of patient outcomes, so we'll leave that one blank. And we've got our central tendency measures that we could choose. So as of this data one says, it's age mean. We're going to choose mean here. We could, of course, make another one for age median. As you can see, that was done in this project because not all of these studies report something like age as a standardized way. So you could see mean, you could see median, and you're able to decide your dispersion method, of course, as well. As we look at the different data types, so that was a good example of a continuous data element, but we've also got things like dichotomous data elements, so something like distal emboli. How many people actually experience distal emboli? We just put in that number of, that event data where we look and see, okay, how many people experienced distal emboli, or how many people experienced mortality, and we're able to just put a number in and say, okay, this is how many people out of our total were able to experience that. I don't think we have an example of a categorical data element in this nest, but if we want to configure a categorical data element, maybe let's say something like, severity, or something that would have more than one category, you'd be able to define that here as well and be able to collect across those different categories. And so,
Ranita, can we just dive in and do that? Just show them how it's done.
Please. Yeah, let's do that. So once we've gone in and done that configuration, we've really done a lot of the design already by doing that. So, your research design is really off the table at that point. Now, really all we have to do is go in and actually do this for a study. And so you can see here for, this study, we were able to go in, and how I like to do extraction for any studies to really scroll to the first table. And so if I wanted to report, endovascular therapy, I can say, 154 people were treated with endovascular therapy. You can see these are my purple dots right here, and I'll just choose that one. And we're able to say, okay, 146 people were treated with just the standard medical care. So we'll give them an arm as well. From there, we're able to go in and just say, okay, age is reported in this study as a mean. So we'll just fill out this field right here with the mean information we see in this table. And the same thing for things like mortality, and across all of our different endpoints, baseline and outcomes. The other important thing to note here is that we're able to define a time point. So as we discussed last week, when we're trying to go in and do these common data elements or trying to decide the studies, studies don't report things in a standardized way. And so by saying, let's say mortality is defined in the study as maybe 90 days, or something like MRS02 is defined as an outcome at 90 days. That allows us to say, okay, this is comparable across different studies by defining this time point, because, MRS02 at 90 days could be different, at 2 months, could be different at 1 year. We want to just make sure we're able to report that for, a standardization and heterogeneity. And so that's how the extraction module works, and how it plays into the research design. I'm not sure if you also want me to go into the qualitative or the quantitative synthesis, Jeff, as well.
We'll get into that. Hold on to that thought for just a second. Great. Yeah, because there's a lot to unpack in what you just said. But if I can summarize just a little bit, the name of the game, in many ways, is comparison, right? You want to be able to compare these things, and also you want to be able to know what to harmonize and how to harmonize, and whether or not you can even harmonize, particular data, together, right? So I want to move to Kevin. I want to move to Kevin now because I still think we might have a bit of a case to make for why tag, and also why hierarchy, right? And Kevin, I wonder if you can just wax poetic about the early days for a moment of NK, even like a little bit pre-NK. Because I think it's a good story. I think it's worth our time to dive into that for a second. Go ahead.
Yeah, let's zoom all the way out. We're talking now about, let's harmonize data elements and let's make sure that we're aligning interventions. Let's zoom all the way out and say, okay, how do we combine 2 papers in the medical literature or 3 papers in the medical literature? And I actually encountered that exact problem when I was working at the NIH. I managed to swing an internship there by the work that I did, helping doctors write papers, but I really wasn't an experienced meta-analyst at the time myself. And I was basically given a project that was supposed to be like full-time project for 3 months to do a meta-analysis on new neurotechnologies that the NIH was thinking of funding, and basically asking me, hey, can you do a meta-analysis that focuses on red flagging patient risks? And that sounds like you take that on, you say, okay, our study design, right? Research question, what new neurotechnologies have what patient risks? And I looking back at that now, we can probably say that's a pretty broad research question, and you should probably, define things like, what do you mean by neurotechnology, and what risks are you really looking for? But of course, young and intrepid Kevin just dug in and built an Excel sheet, started to throw PMIDs into it of papers about basically brain-computer interfaces, right? So invasive technologies you put in your brain, and then they try to some extent read your mind, sort of presaging what Elon Musk and his competitors are doing these days. So in that effort, I basically found that it was almost impossible to get 2 different therapies to align on what risks they're reporting. Like the risk categories that I was encountering were effectively, they were related, but they weren't they weren't exactly the same. Hence, my learnings about what a common data element is, as opposed to just, let's say similar concepts. But the other piece of it was that I actually couldn't all fit it all in one spreadsheet. And so I was literally reduced as, again, technologically enough member of the team, to making nested Excel sheets, where I would make an entire Excel sheet link with each cell to another Excel sheet that actually contains the underlying data for that question, right? So it would be like new brain-computer interface, like endovascular implant, and then it would be like a risk related to, patient privacy. And so you go to the patient privacy cell, you click on it, and it would, boom, expand into a whole nother Excel sheet that contains each study's different metrics for that, because they didn't align on the metrics, and that lined up each of the potential endovascular therapies for that. And nesting Excel sheets that way made it completely unreadable to anyone but me, right? Because if you hadn't built it, how are you supposed to really know which cells correspond to what outputs? How are we supposed to access exactly what we're trying to answer there? And really, you cannot shove nested information into that sort of custom system without basically, I think, custom building a software for the purpose. And so my experience there made me see really like 2 at the ground level things, and then 1 higher up, conclusion about how science works. So the 2 on the ground pieces are: the first thing you need to do when you're designing a study is define a concrete set of interventions and outcomes, and they need to be able to be compared to each other. It's a very simple conclusion that I think most meta-analysts get to, but if you don't do so, you're going to literally end up with exploding Excel sheets. And then the second conclusion was that the way that I was going about doing it was simply fundamentally wrong, in that going into one Excel sheet and trying to get every bit of data related to that entire process into one place was simply not going to work. There wouldn't be traceability to where you originally found the data. There wouldn't be, an easy way to see what intervention led to what outcome, and also see even like the study that information came from. I was effectively trying to shove the entire NK process into one hyper dense set of cells in a 2-dimensional screen, right? So if you can't do it that way, you really have to move it. You have to start thinking about this as a process and not just as 2-dimensional output. You have to think, okay, where are these studies coming from? Once we get to those studies, how are we going to classify them? Once we've classified them, and the simplest classification is like relevant, not relevant, right? In or out. What information do you actually care about from them? And within that question, what information do we care about from them that can be aligned between studies? And that simply cannot be accomplished in one environment, which is why, when we conceptualized NK, we lined it up with taking each of those questions in as their own separate step in the process, rather than trying to shove all of that into one Excel sheet output. The higher level scientific conclusion that I made about it, though, was that there is no way that we're going to actually meta-analyze any substantial amount of the scientific literature, and I don't mean me, I mean like the entire scientific community will not be able to keep up with meta-analytical outputs unless we can actually make a system where it's easy enough to get that transparency of whether or not there are common data elements and then move forward with an actual meta-analysis. It wasn't going to happen without a system for that, right? So what we've really tried to do here is provide a system where, given a concrete research question, you can actually proceed through those steps and get to an output that isn't as dense as Kevin's original Excel sheets, that can then be compared along that you can use to compare underlying studies with respect to things that you know that they share. Anyway, that's a long combination of scientific theory and personal history, but I think Ranita's already shown what a good version of it looks like. I'd also love to basically go into pitfalls and shortcomings there, but first I'd love to throw it to everybody else here.
Yeah. Hence the name, right? Nested knowledge. I think exploding Excel sheets. If I didn't have trademark concerns there, that'd be a good name too. It's so volatile. But yeah, nested knowledge. Hence the name, right? That's kind of what we're after here. We're trying to figure out how to nest knowledge in such a way that it can actually have an impact on medicine. And you can, by the way, if you're watching the stream, if you haven't heard of us before, or if you've never tried us out, you can try this process out. It's not for everybody. It's certainly a complicated process, but you can sign up for our software today and create an entire review in our software for free. Just sign up at nested-knowledge.com. Try it out if you are so inclined. Let's have Nicole. If you want to let's just jump back to you for a second. If you want to share your screen and maybe share a good example, let's talk about a good example, and maybe if you have a bad one as well. I want to just really juxtapose those two hierarchies, because we've had our share of failings at NK with research projects in the past. I like to think we're getting really good at it at this point, and I don't know, maybe you can speak to that, Nicole. But it's not all gold, right? And you have to that's kind of how science works. You have to experiment and you have to fail occasionally and create some really bad tagging hierarchies before you can know necessarily what makes a really great tagging hierarchy. So if you want to share your screen and show us one of those, go ahead. Let's take a look. I'm very curious.
Absolutely. So I'm going to start with a bad example because I think the good looks really good after looking at a bad example. So sharing my screen. Hopefully this time it actually works. I know last time there was a little bit of a technical glitch. So thumbs up.
Hold on. Let me turn it on. Here we go. Hey, fingers crossed. I hope they see it. Go ahead.
All right. Great. So do let me know if someone in the chat says they can't see it. But this is our PCSK9 Nest, and this is the hierarchy for it. And, looking at this, my immediate reaction is, what am I looking at? Like, what is going on? Like, what is the point of this nest? It's been so long since I've even looked at this. I can barely tell you, and I definitely
looks dense, Nicole. I mean, it looks like a lot.
Dense.
There's a lot going on. I'm a little scared. I'm a little intimidated, actually.
Yes, that's an appropriate reaction. I am too. So the reason why I would not consider this to be a good hierarchy is that the research question is not clear from looking at this hierarchy. Because Jeff, if I asked you, what is the primary outcome of this nest? Like, what are we studying here besides PCSK9, right?
Yeah.
What would you take away from this? No idea, right?
No, I see lipids. I don't know. I'm not sure. Pharmaceuticals,
right?
Maybe?
It's like there's just a lot going on here. It's like, what are we reporting in the manuscript? Like, these are all the outcomes. There's no way one manuscript this has got to be like 30 outcomes, right? Like, what was the intention when creating this nest? It's totally unclear. So that's why I would not consider this to be a very great hierarchy. So to contrast that, let's look at this one. So Jeff, if I asked you, and let me scroll over, what is this about, right? So you've got these very clear interventions. So let's look at the interventions here. Like, what is this? There's a lot going on here, right?
Very busy. And then that, I'm not exactly a trained meta-analysis, but I'm seeing a much tidier kind of hierarchy here. And yeah, so you've got standard medical therapy only as one intervention versus endovascular therapy plus minus medical therapy. I have to like get my face is too close to my camera to read that. But yeah, so you're seeing two interventions compared, and then you're seeing like some outcomes, but they're kind of, even the outcomes, even though there's a lot of outcomes, they're still tidily categorized by those parent tags.
Yeah, right? Really, there's three types of outcomes here. There's angiographic outcomes, which these are all pretty similar. Like at least the first three are pretty similar. There's clinical outcomes, which there's, a couple different types of these, and then there's procedural outcomes. So really there's like, if you condense these outcomes into different types, there's like, I don't know, about 7, right? And usually there'll be like a couple primary outcomes and then a few secondary. This is very much in line with what you'll see in a meta-analysis. It's like a handful more or less of outcomes reported, right? And then some baseline characteristics, right? So this is just, it's much more obvious to me what the researcher was trying to do here, right? I know exactly what they're trying to write the paper on. They're trying to compare, and it even
let's work that backward,
right?
And let's compare it against the exploded Excel sheet and the PCSK9 concept, right? Can you, as an outside party, go into someone else's meta-analysis and figure out what their research question was? I think that's a pretty good metric of, are you doing good, transparent, replicable research? I've already told you the story of an undefined research question with no definition of clear outcomes other than risks. Can we look at PCSK9 and actually try to figure out what the research question of that project was?
Not easily. not very easily.
I think that it looks like it's PCSK9 against other, and if you actually I bring in a little bit of background knowledge, we can say PCSK9 inhibitors are actually a type of drug for like hypertension and heart failure. So it's probably looking at PCSK9 inhibitors against other similar drugs, right? Comparative therapies, but completely scattered comparative therapies ranging from diet and exercise to drugs to placebo. And then it looks like we were really interested in literally hundreds of patient characteristics. So I think this is what we might call a fishing expedition in terms of trying to find what might be impactful, rather than actually having any sort of theory about what is relevant to the use of PCSK9. Like, is there a potential background characteristic that could impact the effect of that given drug? And then similarly for outcomes, it doesn't look like we've actually targeted the real risks or benefits that we're actually trying to figure out about PCSK9 inhibitors or competing therapies. Thank you. Love the audience participation. I love the correction. PCSK9 are lipid-lowering drugs. I think that still impacts your hypertension, but I love being corrected, so thank you.
I'm just gonna pause you to zoom in here, Kevin, for a second. If you're following along at home, I have linked out to the published version of the Nest that we were looking at previously, the good one, PCSK9, whatever that one, not published. So I'm sorry, I can't show you that Nest, but I have linked to the other one, and we'll talk about that one in a second again. I can also, I think the Basilar artery stroke Nest is also public, Kevin. And
it's also public, so we can.
So I'm going to throw that in the chat as well, and you can follow along, and you can see what it looks like in our software, and then what that publication looks like after the fact. I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, you're good. And I think that the other thing that you can tell from this Nest, just doing that archaeology, it looks like the people who are collecting this, which is the past versions of us trying to be good researchers in grabbing these things, is that we've really provided a ton of intermediate structure to these outcomes, trying to classify them in a way that may be more cognizable to us. But I think that's incredibly confusing for everybody else, right? There are so many different types of adverse events that we've classified. And then all the other outcomes under clinical outcomes are also heavily subcategorized. That I think that shows a little bit of a lack of focus. Effectively, it's a lack of narrowing in on the things that are going to matter as outcomes. Grabbing LDLC of 8 different varieties. I think that just shows the lack of focus on what would be the important outcome to track in PCSK9 patients. And so this is where I think expertise in subject matter is really helpful, right? Like knowing what outcomes are going to be of interest as you go in. Extremely important. And one of the really good reasons to tag studies because if you're leaving sticky notes for yourself all across the published literature, you may be slowly becoming an expert on that literature. But the other piece about it is you can actually flag and identify what are actually going to be relevant outcomes, as opposed to just reported once and then forgotten about by the author and every other scientist in the discipline. And if we jump over to Basilar, let's do some archaeology on the Basilar question.
Yeah, I was going to jump in and say, when I was discussing tagging and how we have a hierarchical structure, really the power is that if we had all of these tags at a singular level, even for a simple hierarchy like Basilar, it would still be very, very hard to keep track of them. But, kind of taking advantage of the way, our brains work as humans and organizing things, right? Many of us have probably taken some Psych 101. Like the structure here enables you and any user to keep track of all of these things pretty easily, which is really nice. Versus if they were just at one level, a bunch of lone tags floating around, it would be very hard to keep them all in your head at the same time.
And that's actually a great point, Nicole, because I think that's kind of like how the clinical context should inform the design, right? I think that's kind of like the piece that always is missing, is that what we're really trying to do, right, is trying to, if we're trying to get a publication or trying to do a meta-analysis, we want to think, how is this contributing to the medical literature? For something like PCSK9, right, how is that contributing to the medical literature? I mean, it looks like you're trying to collect every single study and every single, thought that's ever been published on PCSK9, and that's really going to be too general, whereas something like this is going to, it's going to be able to inform the field in a direct way and in something that provides context. And by defining those outcomes the way that we've done, so angiographic, clinical, and then I don't know what the third one was, procedural, we're able to say something about those, 3 different categories. And that's something a reviewer is going to look favorably upon, right? That we can provide that sort of context and say, this is actually what we're trying to do. And this is how we're able to contribute and expand the literature that's available.
Awesome. So can we, just to go back to something Ranita said earlier, can we just briefly just look at the synthesis for this particular, the meta-analysis portion specifically? Maybe we can talk about what are some of those outcomes. Can we take a look at those?
I can talk through this, and I think that the first thing to look at here is going to be angiographic outcomes. So if we can get TICI and FPE up there. So actually, Nicole and I were intimately involved in this, and I love stroke research about this, about these questions. But basilar artery strokes are some of the most harmful strokes. They're in your posterior circulation, and so they're very close to the brainstem. Any damage that is done from lack of blood is immediately going to start impacting the patient. So there's still a question, even though treating anterior circulation strokes with thrombectomy has been totally accepted as standard of care, people still have this outstanding question about, do basilar artery strokes respond as well to the therapy in question? And so, if you want to grab TICI there, obviously, if you're going to use a minimally invasive procedure rather than a drug, you're going to have way higher rates of recanalization. So I think that was the expected result of it, of this study, to say, hey, across 2 RCTs and a high quality registry study, it looks like clots are cleared way more often with the new thrombectomy therapies rather than thrombolysis. But I think that then the question becomes, does that matter for the patient, right? And that's really what the study centered in on, was, do those angiographic outcomes translate into those clinical outcomes of interest? And though acronyms might confuse some of us out there, really what SICH is there a hemorrhage in your brain that causes negative symptoms? And MRS 0 to 2 is simply a question of, did you achieve a good neurofunctional outcome? And so those are really where you're going to make a difference, as well as mortality. Obviously, changing patients' mortality is a big part of the goal here. So the findings of this meta-analysis were that there were incredibly close to significant differences in mortality, SICH, and MRS 0 to 2 with thrombectomy over thrombolysis. And I recently attended a conference where 2 more RCTs in this of this exact question were published, corroborating the exact findings that effectively that we published. And so I think that we're going to get even more confirmation that in our narrow research question of, hey, does the Does pulling out clots actually help patients who have, the worst type of stroke? Does it help them survive? Does it help them with their neurological outcome? Does it help keep their brain from getting a hemorrhage in their brain? Those are pretty directed questions that have very specific patient outcomes related to them. And I was able to, because it was so clear in this meta-analysis, I was able to actually just compare this to research as it was presented in public for the first time and say, hey, does this corroborate or does this not corroborate the research that nested knowledge has helped put into the literature?
Yeah, you bring up a great point, and I think it's something we have hammered a lot, but I don't know if we've talked about it too much on the live stream, and that is just the updatable nature of nested knowledge. And I think actually that is part of the strength and part of the justification for why you should spend a little bit more work upfront in creating a good tagging hierarchy, creating a good search, making sure that the literature, that you're set up for success later on. Because if you get the right search and you get the right tagging hierarchy, you're really set up to screen every single record that comes in the relevant space, right, for that particular review from there on out. And you can quite easily keep your review up to date. And what that means is that you have for the first time, really, a truly living meta-analysis with Kevin's previous example where you're linking spreadsheets together and you're trying to hold all of that data in your mind for months on end while you're waiting for the research to be updated. That just becomes gargantuan. It's Sisyphean. You can't do it, that task, right? And yet nested knowledge can keep track of all that data for you. And really, it's nested knowledge, the platform, but it's also just you doing a really good job to set up that tagging hierarchy, set up a really good search so that you can ingest that literature and know, hey, I already have this schema in my head. What does that schema look like? Oh yeah, here's my tagging hierarchy. Here's how I apply these tags, and that's how I categorize this research. And Kevin, you were able to update your review live on stage, like moments before you actually had to go on and present live to all of these stroke researchers, right?
Yeah. Even better than that, really, I wasn't even required to go out and present that. These people, Dr. Raul Noguera and Dr. Tudor Joven, who are some of the leading neurovascular researchers, presented the Bocce and Attention trials, which are both on that exact question. And they just asked me to weigh in on the current state of the literature before they went up, right? So it's like, hey, here's Kevin. He has a meta-analysis software, and he's able to weigh in on what does the literature say before Bocce and Attention. And I just stayed up there and talked to them afterward. And I could, while part of that panel, actually just hop on my laptop and throw their evidence into our extraction module and put together a new quantitative synthesis output so we could actually see evidence in context, right? Because it's also, for Dr. Noguera to go up there and present his evidence, and, mortality was 25%, which is pretty good for basal artery strokes. And we think that was comparable with the Chinese RCTs, and actually be able to say, okay, was it comparable? Like, what were the confidence intervals around that? Do they line up with that evidence? By adding attention, do we actually go from nearly significant to significant with those results? And the answer, actually, those questions are all yes. With the software, and I was able to do it live on stage, just put in the evidence. And because that knowledge handoff, right, I didn't actually, it wasn't just me putting together a spreadsheet at the beginning of this. It was an entire team with Nicole and some Stanford collaborators who put together all of that knowledge in a way that was so transparent and easy for me to work with that it was no trouble to basically say, hey, let's take this comparable study that's up on the slides, find the outcomes that are exactly the same, and enter them into a system. So I think that's really part of this difference. Like, it's entirely Sisyphean, as Jeff said, bringing in Greek mythological.
Yeah, a little mythology, just for fun. Yeah, right.
Of course, just for fun. But that's only if you can't actually have some sort of handoff, right? Like, you have to be able to have your structured knowledge be so accessible that anyone can come along who has knowledge of the discipline and do what I did with physicians and just say, hey, here's the new evidence on this question. And the structure is what allows you to actually, very easily enter that, rather than, of course, go back to the bottom of the mountain and pick up the rock again.
Yep, that's good science. And I should just say it's time for the shameless plug again. You could do this. You could do this right now if you're listening in and you're like, hey, I want that kind of flexibility and power in my next review, and I want to whatever. you can sign up for our platform right now, nested-knowledge.com. The link is in the chat, and you can just go there and sign up and try it out. Also, I should say too, if you want like a demonstration, if you're buying for a team today and you're thinking about, like whatever, you want to just evaluate the effectiveness of our platform. In that sense, we also have forms you can fill out on our website. You can just go there, and one of us, possibly on this call, or Keith, our sales guy, will reach out to you in short order, and he'll get you all set up and ready to go for your next review. So yeah, I want to just close out today's conversation and just maybe some really quick tips, because it's often not. Yeah, I do see we have a question there, but it's not complete. Renita, can you see it better on your end? I see.
No, I have the same issue, and so
wait. Here we go. Nested Knowledge is very good in working with RCT. Does it have a way to extract descriptive studies for meta-analysis?
So this is a great question, and what we presented there was an RCT, a meta-analysis of RCTs. So definitely there's also those tools in there to do a network meta-analysis on top of that data, and so that's really built with the assumption that you have comparable cohorts. So there are those pieces that are built in that are really helpful when you have an RCT-based meta-analysis. But let's start from just the process, right? The process of extracting, the process of searching and screening and tagging and extracting all work for descriptive studies. So any sort of descriptive study, if you're looking to combine them in any way, whether that's qualitatively, just like I want to look at 9 studies that are on my topic of interest, they might not have comparable outcomes, but I want to be able to discuss them. Going through the tagging process is exactly how I do that. When I need to do a more descriptive review or just a systematic review, no meta-analysis, you can still use all of our systems through until you get to the ones that are like automatic calculation for meta-analysis. When it comes to doing comparisons on top of those, that's where I think it's less about that we don't have the tools and more about you should be cautious using us, right? If you collect, say, if those 9 studies happen to be comparative, like cohort studies, but they're retrospective and you don't know if their patient populations are similar, and you may want to examine like their inclusion criteria to see if they actually align, that's where our tool actually, you can actually gather the evidence, you can extract in the software, and it will do a network meta-analysis on top of it. What you want to do is be very careful with what you do with those results, because most of the time, if you are comparing, non-RCTs, like let's just say evidence that's lower on the on the evidence hierarchy, you probably want to talk to a biostatistician about kicking out outliers, about maybe even narrowing in on the study types that you're going to accept or the study populations that you're going to accept. Because really what you want to do for any meta-analysis, whether it's in our software or not, you need to get to a comparable cohort of patients on either side of the comparison. If you're not doing that, you're not going to, you're basically going to have a potentially biased outcome, regardless of where you actually do your gathering. So I'd say if you're gathering descriptive studies for any reason, you can follow the same process that you do for an RCT in our software. Easy. Then be extraordinarily cautious about how you proceed with our automated statistical tools, where potentially narrowing your study set, narrowing patient populations, or honestly, my biggest recommendation is consult a biostatistician about examining study heterogeneity, really drilling down on what is comparable within your data set before you actually say, hey, here's a comparison. That's my biggest recommendation for using NK for meta-analysis, or using non-RCTs for meta-analysis generally.
That's actually a perfect transition, because I want to talk about pitfalls, right? How can this process go horribly wrong? And I'm sure it's happened even when you set yourself up for success. I'm sure there are things that you should probably know about how to actually conduct a meta-analysis, how to do some data extraction in our software. Where can that process go wrong? Let's start with Ranita. Go. Let's just switch it up. You first. Where can this go wrong? Specifically thinking about our clients, thinking about people who are paying for our software, possibly on the corporate end of things, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I'll start out with people that are not in our software, I guess just as in the industry in general. And I would say, just as we're looking at all these different ways to go and go about and do a meta-analysis and that sort of thing, the traditional way to do it, as Kevin was saying, is going to be spreadsheets, right? It's going to require maybe not just one software, but several. Maybe you're doing the screening in EndNote or something like that. Maybe you're going to another software software like Excel to do the extraction. You don't have really that tagging component. Instead, it's just, maybe a comment, column within your Excel spreadsheet, or you leave comments for your teammates. And it requires a lot of compiling. It requires a lot of coordination, countless hundreds of emails sometimes. And then, of course, once you do have that spreadsheet, once you've got it quality controlled, once you've done a good job of going in and looking at each study and evaluating it, you've also got to go and maybe throw that spreadsheet into something like R, Python, or SAS, Stata to do the actual analysis. And so across all that chaos and across all of that collecting, a lot of things can go wrong. It's a matter of really of trying to evaluate the quality most of the time. So Nicole and I are big fans and have done a lot of the quality control at Nested Knowledge for our internal projects. And so when you're trying to go in and look at these studies, you've screened them, you've maybe tagged them, you've gone and done the extraction. Now it requires actually going in and looking at each data element that was collected and seeing, did we do this correctly? Should this study actually have been included? What was the methodology that people were given? Is the dosage comparable? Are the data elements comparable? Were they collected at the same time point? All of those sort of things have to be, you have to think about the context of the actual study as you're thinking about, okay, I'm going to compare it to other studies. That's really where the heterogeneity comes in. A lot of things will kind of involve maybe a risk of bias assessment. So maybe you want to go and see, what is the quality of evidence we're looking at? But that can only account for so much. It's also going to require a human eye to go in and look at the study and say, this is actually comparable. We can actually say that this group of people, when treated with this specific treatment or drug, we can actually compare them to, this other group of people. That's a huge part of the quality control, and that's a huge part of meta-analysis in general. And like I said, as we're going and evaluating studies, it certainly helps to be able to go and comment on an exact study as you're doing the quality control and say, hey, I found this, this line in the study that, I'm thinking maybe this is going to have an impact on whether we include or exclude this, or it might have an impact on how we actually treat the study in our meta-analysis. And that's a huge a benefit, I think, to going in and doing this in the 9K software, is just having the ability to comment on studies and evaluate them at that level, and getting other people's, opinion on the study. Because, research is a team sport. You want to be able to, talk to your team and be able to say, okay, we've done the right thing here. We're confident in our analysis, and we're confident in the studies that we've included. And so I know I covered a lot there, but I think that's really a large portion, is the communication aspect and being able to evaluate the studies at the end, and say, we've collected data, we've collected high quality data, and we've collected data that's relevant and comparable across these different studies.
Absolutely. Those collaborative features are going to keep you more organized, and they're going to actually improve your workflow, not just from like a time perspective, but also an accuracy perspective, right? Nicole, anything to add?
Yeah, I have a lot to add. A big part of my job, and Kevin's laughing because I think he knows where I'm going to go. A big part of my job is quality control. And sometimes what goes wrong has, nothing to do with the software and everything to do with, not having, a sufficient statistical background to understand how to extract something correctly, right? So if you don't know the difference between a mean and a median, and you extract them both as the same thing interchangeably, that's a problem, right? For when you're performing a meta-analysis, that's the problem with the quality of the extracted data, right? And you could have the best algorithm in the world, and if what you put into it isn't good, what you're going to get out is good. Like almost everything in statistics, garbage in, garbage out, right? And so, a thing that could go wrong is just, not having experience in stats, and, not having kind of that knowledge base to know, how to correctly extract a study in a discipline, right? So knowing how to, differentiate between means and medians, standard deviations and standard errors, ranges, interquartile ranges, right? Like kind of having that baseline vocabulary so that you can correctly configure and extract things is really, really fundamental to even being able to consider using quantitative synthesis, right? Because you could have the best RCTs ever, right? So an RCT that's pristinely conducted, but if you don't collect the data correctly, it's going to be garbage in, garbage out. So that's just something to definitely keep in mind, is that, you know, you're staying abreast of your stats and, you know, keeping Stats 101 fresh in your head as you're going through, and just being very meticulous when doing quality control and just making sure things are, you know, extracted correctly.
Awesome. Kevin, same question. What are some pitfalls that people might encounter when trying to extract data in NK? What should they be aware of?
Great question. I actually want to field another one from the comments, though.
Oh, sure.
Abil, these are great questions, and
yeah, thank you.
Please keep coming to live streams and asking good questions. So we actually have our manuscript editor is live and ready for you. In terms of assistance, though, so that's an environment where you can draft your article. The big pieces there, you can automatically generate your Prisma chart, and you can also automatically generate customized, updatable tables of your data. Those are things that we build in to help you out. We don't have any plagiarism checking. I recommend something along the lines of Authenticate for that. We may go in that direction at some point, but since we see ourselves as like going from search through to your data set and then trying to get you to a study that you can move forward with, we're not trying to like enter sort of the space where I think mostly like journals maintain like plagiarism rules. And I think that we could try to help in that, but I don't know if we're the best position to actually do so. So I'd look up Authenticate is the one that I know of in that realm. There are probably a lot of other competitors as well. Citation management is built into manuscript. So if you want to add citations to your manuscript, it's one click within our manuscript editor. I do like to be upfront with limitations. We don't have as much editability of the structure of that citation. So if your journal of interest has a bunch of different and very specific requirements around like formatting, then you can export RIS files from the inspector page in our software, and that can interface really nicely with the citation manager. So just export from inspector all of the RIS files that you want into a citation manager, and then that'll hand it off really nice. It'll be a library for you already. So if you don't need to be really specific about formats, use ours in manuscript. If you do, use RIS export. And then the last thing that I'll plug that I'm looking forward to very soon, and you can kind of try it out. If you are in an organization that has any good written output, for instance, if they have a really good protocol, go into the organization page and make a protocol template so that you can in one click just import a really good template that you can write from. I find that the biggest pitfall of writing, if we're going to go back to Jeff's question, the biggest pitfall when writing, which I have a heck of a lot of experience with outside of meta-analysis as well, is blank pages. Blank pages are huge problems. And so having a template to work from is a huge help, because it basically tells you the questions you need to answer, as opposed to asking you to figure out all the, all of the answers that you need to put out there without any guidance. So templates are live already for protocol, and we will be making manuscript template as well that will follow the same basic structure, where if you have a really good protocol within your organization, go into organization page, take that nest, add its protocol as a template, take out any study-specific information, and then anyone who's in your organization can just add that template to their protocol as soon as they enter any new nest, and then soon for any manuscript as well.
I will say too. Sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to follow up with maybe my biggest sort of warnings. Let me make this pitfalls about study design. And this is going to bring it right back to the topic we've had, I think, this whole time, which is really just setting yourself up for good extraction. Ranita covered really well, I think, extracting badly, right? Like, how can you mess up in the extraction process? But how can you set up yourself for failure when you're establishing a nest, right? And I think that the takeaway from today should really be concrete, simple, and narrow interventions and outcomes of interest that you think that you could hand off to any other expert in your field just by showing them the nest. If you can get it to that level, then you are probably setting yourself up for extracting very simply and being able to compare without confusion. If you are creating a nest that would take your expertise, that would take Kevin running around with his exploded Excel sheets to explain to any viewer, then you're probably not setting yourself up for a successful extraction, and you're probably not setting yourself up for a successful manuscript, successful analysis, or successful communication to the public about your research. So that's my plug on biggest pitfall to avoid.
Awesome. I just wanted to plug our support page. So if you enjoyed today's, live stream, obviously we do this every week, or at least we're trying to. We're going to see how it goes. If people keep watching them, we will keep doing them. And you can RSVP or just see when the next ones are coming up on our support page. I've linked that in the chat as well. On our support page, we have other options for support. So Abil, that's a great feature request is actually what I would say, like the idea of having a plagiarism checker. I would love to build that. I would love to design that and see if we can get that into our manuscript someday. I don't know what the priority, we always have a roadmap, right? We're always trying to figure out how to prioritize features, but we are always improving our software. We are always making it better. And so if you have other great feature ideas like that one, you can go onto our support page, click the leave feedback button, and a developer will take a look at that and take it into consideration when we consider what other features to build. You can also just email support. So obviously these live streams only happen once a week, but you can email support whenever you want, and we will try to get back to you in as timely a manner as possible. But that's our hour. So thank you three for being on. Thanks the audience for some participation, and we'll see you right here next week, folks. Thank you so much.
Thanks all.
See ya.
Thank you.